Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Monday night lectures of the Explorers Club. I am very excited to be hosting an incredible evening of the most innovative people working on climate change and community empowerment. My name is Mark Fowler. I am the Vice President of Wildlife Conservation and Sustainability at the Explorers Club, and I am the Nature Initiative Director at Grace Farms Foundation. I am super excited to be introducing Mike Korchinski. Mike is the founder of Wildlife Works. Wildlife Works is an incredibly innovative, for-profit, market-based solution for preserving forests and saving carbon in the forests, as well as empowering communities and protecting wildlife. This is literally the most, in my opinion, one of the most cutting-edge, exciting ways that we have seen to actually solve the problems of climate change, forest degradation, protecting wildlife, and empowering communities. So it's an incredible program. I have partnered with them at Grace Farms Foundation, and we will be working on new projects with them around the globe. They're in many countries you'll be hearing about tonight, and they are literally saving millions of tons of carbon from going into the atmosphere by protecting forests. So tonight we'll hear from Mike, and we're going to see a presentation about Wildlife Works, and we will also see a couple videos, and then afterwards we'll do a little discussion and then Q&A with all of you who are watching. Honestly, I am so excited for this program, and I am very honored to introduce Mike Korchinski. Mike, here you go.
All right. Well, thank you very much, Mark. Hopefully you can all hear me. And before I turn on my presentation, I think I disappear when I put my presentation on, but we'll figure that out. But yeah, so I'm going to share a presentation just explaining a little bit who we are, show some videos, and then answer your questions. So without further ado, let me share my screen. All right, so I'm hoping you can see a beautiful cliff and forest. Does that look like what you can see? Because now, all right.
You're all set.
Yes, we can. It looks great, Mike.
All right, awesome. So I am Mike Korchinski. I'm the founder and president of Wildlife Works. We've been actually around for 24 years. 24 years ago, we might have been the only company doing conservation work. I suppose there's probably a few more now, but it's still relatively rare. The reason why we're a company is because of the origin story, really, which I'll get to in a second. Mostly, so I'm going to talk about Wildlife Works. I'm going to talk a little bit about the climate challenge. I'm sure by now, especially this year, we are all very aware of the climate challenge and how it's affecting the world. And I'm going to talk, so I'm not going to dwell on it. I'm just going to go quickly through the challenge and how the work that we do addresses one significant element of the climate challenge. Then I'm going to talk a little bit about how we measure success in our projects. So we don't just measure success in mitigating climate. We measure success in addressing as many of the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals as we can, because we work for the most part in the global south. So we have projects in many countries that have many challenges that we can help with. And then I'm going to talk about the status of our work and where are we in 2021 with what many people call nature-based solutions to climate and biodiversity challenge. And then the last point there is we're not where we need to be, and so a couple of reasons why we're not quite where we need to be. Okay, so that's the presentation. First, who is Wildlife Works? So I started Wildlife Works in 1997 after I had been in the business community, had a consulting company that worked mostly with very large companies going through transitions, big transitions. So how did they, change from doing one big thing that had made them successful to doing another thing because the competitive marketplace forced them to do so, and they had 300,000 employees and had to figure out that somebody on Monday morning had to do something different, or they just keep going on the same path, but they had no idea which of their 300,000 employees needed to do something different and what they needed to do differently. So we worked in, a large part of what we call re-engineering of businesses, and then change management became a huge part of our work, working with people to help them welcome change instead of fearing change, which most of us do. So I sold the company, went to Africa, had always been a huge fan of elephants, even though I'd never seen one in the wild. And I had that cliched epiphany in the bush 24 years ago, where after getting over the jaw-dropping splendor of elephants and other species, it occurred to me that they were in a very fragile moment because they were at great risk of losing their habitat. And so that was what hooked me, was that what struck me as the necessary solution was a solution that engaged the communities locally in a way that they welcomed keeping wildlife and biodiversity intact in their environment, and instead of competing with it for relatively scarce resources. So Wildlife Works, the name, the idea comes from the idea that if we want wildlife, we have to find a way to make it work for local communities. Our first project was in Kenya. So you see a map of Africa there. It's 500,000 acres, the project. There's a couple thousand elephants that use the corridor between two national parks, Tsavo East and Tsavo West. And where that little logo is down in the sort of halfway down Africa on the right, that's where we're located in southeastern Kenya. Coming out of the business community, I didn't know how to run an NGO. I had no idea. And it also occurred to me that there are lots of fantastic NGOs out there that were wrestling with not enough funding and trying to repair that the rest of the world was doing to nature. And so part of our mission from the beginning was to try and engage the marketplace as part of the solution, and so that we're not trying to use limited philanthropic dollars to repair problems that are too big to fix. So that's been part of our mission, to engage the corporate marketplace in ways that are helpful rather than harmful. So we call our approach a holistic approach. There are three pillars. We do wildlife protection, although in a very interesting unarmed way in most of our work. We do job creation. We realize that economic development is the root of solving economic problems for these communities that live generally in marginalized areas where you find wildlife still. And we do protect forests, because the forests, as it turns out, have become the economic engine of our work. And so the economic engine is the sale of what people commonly call carbon credits that we earn from demonstrating our ability to protect forests that were otherwise disappearing. So that's our approach. Our mission has changed a little bit over the years, because carbon didn't exist in 1997. The Kyoto Protocol hadn't actually happened. So when I first had this idea, it was really an idea without a product for many years. And then over the years, in roughly mid-2000s, the idea of RED, of what we do, which is a climate mitigation mechanism called RED, reducing emissions from deforestation and degradation, became an idea out of the United Nations. And so we started pursuing that in the mid-2000s with the idea that we could create a market-based solution around it that would solve conservation challenges. Economic. Not all conservation challenges are economic, by the way. Most of them are, but this is definitely not a one-size-fits-all, but it's a one-size-fits-many as it happens. We've revised our mission recently, because we've actually now demonstrated that this solution does work and works very well. And so our new mission is to massively scale our proven market-based solution for wildlife conservation as quickly as possible, so that biodiversity and forest communities thrive. And that's quickly as possible is on all of our minds, not just because we're aging, but because the general consensus is that we have maybe another decade to make a difference on the climate front, and possibly on the biodiversity front, before we start seeing even worse outcomes around the world. So we're engaged in an effort to massively scale our work, which I'll talk more about later. I'm going to quickly mention climate change and RED, just to set some level of knowledge. So this, I hope you can see a graph. It's sort of sitting behind the faces on mine a little bit, but there's a graph on the right-hand side over here, and that graph is put out by the United Nations. And the gray line going up and to the right is where we are now. The yellowish colored line is the best case that we are projected to be able to achieve. Then you see two other lines, a pinky one and a green one. Those are based on the commitments made at the Paris Agreement. So you may have heard of the Paris Agreement on climate, where countries came forward and made commitments about what they thought they could achieve to help us all mitigate the impacts or the worst impacts of climate. That if you add up all their commitments, that's what you get, that trajectory. And then sadly, if you look at the blue and the purple one, that's the trajectory that we need to be on to keep the rise in temperature to either 2 degrees or ideally 1.5 degrees in the future. And so, as you can see, we're way off target right now. And so there's a growing desire amongst those that make rules around the world that we try and get more serious about this problem. And what that's done is it's created an opportunity to finance anything that involves protecting forests, because forests, as it turns out, contain a lot of carbon, and forests being destroyed, which is also happening sadly at a very alarming rate, release a lot of carbon. So deforestation, many people don't know this, but it's the largest source of emissions in the world after energy. So energy production is the largest. So keeping us, warm and illuminated is the highest use of emissions, the highest creation of emissions using fossil fuels, of course. But deforestation for a whole range of human activity, from not just forestry, but agriculture and other things, is the second largest. It's more than all the forms of transportation combined. So more than all the cars in the world, more than all the trains in the world combined, than all the airplanes. And so it's a big piece of the problem, but it created an opportunity for us to look at a way to finance the stopping of deforestation and therefore the protection of wilderness using climate market mechanisms. And the UN invented this idea first. It was called REDD, Reducing Emissions from Deforestation and Forest Degradation. And the idea is that if you can prove you've stopped deforestation, then you should get credit for avoiding the emissions that were occurring every year from that deforestation. So that's the market we're in, is to prove that we've stopped deforestation and to benefit from that by being given these carbon credits. Each credit represents 1 ton of pollution, essentially 1 ton of CO2 emissions that have been avoided. And then we have to sell those things to people around the world who are trying to do their best to help financially where they can't reduce their emissions in another way. So basic idea behind REDD Plus is it's really the only mechanism that I can think of, and I've done this presentation a lot in 20 years or in the last 10 years. Nobody's ever come up with another one. It's the only one where we've actually put a price on a standing forest. We have lots of value for cutting forests down, timber and farmland and development, all these other things. But to put a price on a standing tree, the protection of forest, there really isn't anything that directly protects that. You might argue tourism or ecotourism is sort of indirectly benefiting from the intact wilderness, but it's not ever been direct enough, and it's not tying value to the standing forest in a direct way. And so REDD is the first one to do that. But it's a pay for performance mechanism. So what does that mean? It means that you have to show that there was deforestation occurring before you began your project. You have to show that you've slowed or stopped. You don't have to stop it completely. Sometimes that's impossible. Slowed or stopped the deforestation. And then if you do, you get awarded these carbon credits. You also have to show that you've done it in collaboration with local communities. You can't do it in a draconian way. It has to be something that was welcomed by the people that you're working with as an improvement for their own livelihoods. And pay for performance is really important. It's a very common business approach, and people in business understand pay for performance. If you don't perform, you're out of business. But the idea behind pay for performance is when funding is finite, you have to deploy it efficiently. And certainly even in, whether it's philanthropy or whether it's in the world we're in market-based conservation, the funding is finite. So you have to make sure that you only use it when you're achieving success. And then, people in organizations, generally, I would say there's probably some exceptions, do what they're paid to do. These are lessons from my business life and all my life, I suppose. And then, more importantly, rewarding good behaviors reinforces and encourages those behaviors to spread. So the point of pay for performance is you set goals in participation with the local community. If they help achieve those goals in slowing or stopping deforestation, you reward them. If they don't achieve those goals, you don't reward them. So you don't just generally pay everybody. You pay people who have done a good job, and that encourages others to do the same thing. So that's the basic idea. Everybody understands pay for performance, I think, in one way or another. And so the way we do REDD+ is we really see it as sort of a transformative rural development program in these communities that we work with, beginning in Kenya and now in other parts of the world. And we measure our success not just in the tons of emissions avoided or the hectares or acres of forest protected, but also against these what we call sustainable development goals. So I'm going to jump and talk a little bit about them in a minute here. But we develop projects that look a lot like conservation projects. So you're going to see a video that outlines the work we did in our initial project in Kenya. And for us, it's this is our first project. It's in southeastern Kenya. It's 500,000 acres. It's not an insignificant number of people. About 110,000 actually people live around the corridor. Nobody lives in the corridor. It was sort of the last remaining bit of intact forest between two national parks when we showed up 24 years ago. And that's why we selected it, because we thought if we could maintain that corridor, then wildlife will have a chance to continue to migrate between the parks as they've always done. And so that's been our first project. There's a video short here coming up that is a long video, but we're going to shorten it for you. So I'm going to go to the next slide and ask my colleague, Kevin, if he can start the video.
It was a beautiful experience coming to the Kasigau Corridor REDD+ project in Kenya. A breathtaking sanctuary where more than 300 species of magnificent wildlife are free to roam. My name is Kasigau. I'm an impact photographer from Sweden with the assignment to document and tell the story about wildlife works and their conservation work. I was blown away when I learned about the positive impact they have on the community and the pride people held working there. It's a conservation project that started in the late 90s for the love of elephants, in an area where they were on a fast track to complete annihilation due to ivory poaching. The community suffered from extreme drought and poverty, and many were forced to destroy their environment just to survive. When I met Mike Koczynski, who founded Wildlife Works, he told me that in 1997, when he was looking for a high-conflict area to try a new market-based approach to conservation, he found Kasigau to turn his vision into reality. A vision based on the core belief that all species have an intrinsic right to exist on Earth. And if we are going to solve human-wildlife conflict, it has to benefit both wildlife and humans.
We need to focus on habitat. The biggest threat in the end to elephants or other species is loss of viable habitat.
Imagine yourself, if you were living in the midst of wildlife who might destroy your crops or eat your livestock, you would likely not oppose poachers. But if the wildlife benefit the community, then the community will support the conservation activities instead. The same goes for the forest. The trees need to benefit the community standing up. That's why REDD+ is so amazing. It's a brilliant framework envisioned by the United Nations, and it stands for reducing emissions from deforestation and forest degradation. The aim is to address the climate crisis by protecting highly threatened forests by giving value to living trees. The forests get protected and therefore the biodiversity as well. The community receives benefits aligned with the UN Sustainable Development Goals in exchange for their support. Wildlife Works' holistic approach to conservation is rooted in sustainable community development. Job creation is an essential part to engage the community in a way that effectively protects the forest and the wildlife for the long term. To create jobs for the community, they first built an organic garment factory and established an unarmed ranger patrol with both men and women. To manage human-wildlife conflict, they also created water holes to keep the wildlife away from the communities. In 2011, the Wildlife Works Kasigau Corridor REDD+ project became the first verified REDD+ project in the world. By successfully stopping the deforestation through extensive activities, the project generates carbon credits. One carbon credit represents 1 ton of CO2 emissions avoided from being released into the atmosphere. The Kasigau REDD+ project avoids annually the release of approximately 1.5 million tons of CO2, and the 500,000 acres of dry land forest stores a total of 104 million tons of CO2.
Okay, I hope everybody's back and can hear me. And I'm going to go back to my presentation. There will be a chance for questions. I realize I'm going through at some speed here in the interest of getting to questions at the end, but there will be an opportunity for questions. So I'm going to talk a little bit about what the UN SDGs are. Maybe you're familiar. You are in the heart of the UN in New York there. Some of you may remember the Millennium Development Goals, which were the UN's previous effort at characterizing human activity and what we need to achieve. Those didn't last very long past the millennium, but the new ones, the Sustainable Development Goals, seem to be really gaining traction and appealing to the imagination of the corporate world, if no one else. And so there's 17 SDGs. It's a lot to remember. Life on land, which is the one that we are most involved in, is number 15. And then climate action is number 13. We're heavily involved in protecting forests to stop deforestation-related emissions. But we address many of the Sustainable Development Goals through the work we do in trying to provide sustainable livelihoods, trying to provide good health outcomes, trying to provide good education. We take a very holistic view. And what didn't come across so much in the video is that those interventions that we do against the SDGs are co-designed by the community themselves. It's their desire for development that is being manifest in our projects, not ours. And what we do is help them understand the economics. What do they have to do in terms of performing and protecting the forest in order to achieve the level of income as a community, allow them to pay for these things that they want to do. So we do some of this is on our website in case you can't read the fine print, but we do have to measure our performance against each of these goals in the work we do. And then our work is audited. So we get international auditors that come and visit. It's thunder here, so I hope it doesn't get any louder. There are independent auditors that audit the work we do every year to make sure that our claims both in terms of climate claims and in terms of these Sustainable Development Goals are being measured correctly and can be supported by the community. So that's the work we do. These are sort of multifunctional projects, really focusing on how do you meet the community's idea of their own development needs in a way that is funded by their agreement to protect their forests. So our job is to bridge between them and the climate marketplace, help do all the science that's needed, help design all the programs, and then we actually run a project on the ground that has nearly 400 direct employees in Kenya from the community who do a whole range of activities that we worked on with them in the design. So we're making a lot of progress. The question is, are we there yet? And unfortunately, the answer is we're getting there. So this is a map of where we are as a company. So the brown areas are where we currently operate projects. So our first one was in Kenya. Second one was in the DRC, the Democratic Republic of the Congo, which is that big brown one in the middle of Africa. The third effort we worked on, the projects that we have are in Colombia, in South America. The fourth one is in Cambodia. And then we just got funded, probably maybe you didn't see, but today we announced a big deal that we struck with a financing organization out of London to develop 25 new projects. And those will be in the blue areas. So we have a pipeline of projects in India and Brazil, Cameroon, Zambia, Mozambique, Indonesia, Ghana, and Panama, which are projects that we hope to begin here in the next few months to replicate the work that we've done in Kenya. The second project that we did was in DRC. I'm going to show you a video of that one just so you can get a sense of what a different project looks like in a tropical rainforest. Oh, I'm seeing lightning. The interesting thing that having started 24 years ago and then got involved in the carbon markets early is that we've become a leader in that space. It's not a very big space. We're big fish in a small pond, as people like to say. But it needs to be a very big pond because roughly a billion, we talk about reducing emissions by 1.5 million tons a year in our Kenya project. Our whole portfolio might reduce emissions by 30 million tons a year. There's probably at least 1 billion tons of emissions coming from deforestation. So we're still, we're the biggest fish in a sea that's huge, but we're still very small. And so there's a need to scale this kind of work very aggressively. We're working closely with a lot of conservation heroes that you may have seen in the past, because they see this as a new way to fund their work, but don't have the expertise necessarily to add it to the work that they're already doing. So we're working both on our own projects and then in partnership with famous world-class NGOs around the world. But we are probably the lead, well, we are for sure now with the investment we just closed, the largest player in this new field. And it's partly because we do everything. We manage the whole life cycle because we had to in Kenya in the first project we did, because there were no NGOs on the ground. It wasn't the favored place of NGOs in Kenya. It's very dry and dusty and lots of conflict with people. And so, which was exactly what we were trying to find. And so we've consequently become very adept at multidimensional projects in many places. Often in post-conflict situations, one of the unfortunate consequences of post-conflict countries is that forests that were previously intact because they were of young men with guns in the war become fair game again when there's peace. So it's a sort of a tragic peace dividend that forests and deforestation accelerates in the post-conflict countries. So we're in the Congo, we're in Colombia for those reasons, to try and see if we can put in alternatives before that destruction ramps up. And we take a holistic approach, which is easy for us as a business. It's one of the sort of happy consequences of not being an NGO, is that we don't have to focus on one element of the problem. We can address whatever element of the problem is effective in achieving the outcome we're looking for, which is happy community, happy forest, happy wildlife. Okay, so the second project, as I mentioned, was in the DRC. A lot of people said, you're lucky to have done that in Kenya because you were there before the red thing started. And we sort of wondered whether that was true, candidly. But we also thought, if you're going to use forests as a mitigation tool for climate, you've got to be in the big ones that are disappearing fast. So I love Africa, so we selected the DRC as the second project that we would work in, and we cleverly took over a logging concession from a logging company, and we don't log, so we didn't take it over and then log. We took it over and then don't log, but we pay all the taxes and everything to the government as if we were a logging company, so they don't complain. And we work with the community to protect what was an active logging concession. And as a result, we now have bonobos and elephants back in, which is in a place called Lake Mai Ndombe on the western shore of Lake Mai Ndombe, which is the largest freshwater lake in the Congo Basin, and part of the largest Ramsar wetlands in the world. And I love the DRC and the people there, and you're going to get a sense of what that looks like in a minute from this video. So I'm going to cue Kevin, and this is another short video, and we'll still have plenty of time for questions.
In the Congo Basin rainforest, one of the most amazing places on planet Earth, lives some of the sweetest people that I have ever met. They still live in a way that they have lived for hundreds of years. It's a community where the electricity have not yet arrived. Their home is the second largest intact rainforest in the world and one of the most significant wetlands on the planet. This forest is one of the most important forests in the fight to halt climate change. A fight that they have nothing to do with, but they hold the key for a solution, and they are prepared to fight with us. This is one of the least developed places on our planet. A place where people still live connected to Mother Earth. In many ways, this is a paradise, but the wisdom of the trees holds a dark history. These kind people have been taken advantage of from colonial days until modern times, with logging companies destroying their home in the name of profit. I wouldn't be surprised if they chased me away when I arrived, but instead they embraced me with open arms. When I talked with the elders, they told me stories about their childhood, when the forest was full of animals and the lake full of fish. Days when the people were happy and had food to eat. Bonobos, forest elephants, and other today endangered species were their neighbors. When the logging companies came, they completely ignored the health of the community and the wildlife, leaving little to no economic benefit to the people. They made so much noise and created terror that scared the animals away and destroyed their natural habitat. But everything changed in 2008, following a governmental revision of the DRC National Forest Code. 91 of 156 logging concessions were suspended in an effort to address corruption in the sector. It was at this time that Wildlife Works implemented the RED+ conservation strategy to prevent 2 of the logging concessions from being restored to logging. In collaboration with the community of 180,000 people living in the 300,000 hectare project area and the government of the Democratic Republic of Congo, they agreed upon using carbon finance to address the community's health, education, and economic development needs. The community decides how to use the money they receive in the best way, and the decisions are made in a democratic manner with substantial representation of women. Since the project launched in 2011, logging has halted, and today Wildlife Works employs over 130 people from the project area, providing effective capacity building support so they can improve the conditions in their community. And together they are building new schools and renovating old schools, training people in organic gardening, introducing crop intensification and more nutritious produce to alleviate the pressure on the local wildlife. Programs are currently being planned to repopulate the lake with fish, supplying vaccines to stop epidemics and building medical clinics. Former hunters are now foresters, teaching the community about the importance of the trees. The biodiversity team is monitoring how bonobos and forest elephants are coming back into the project area, and the animals thrive in harmony with nature. Revenue generated from the sales of carbon credits not only conserve this beautiful and important tropical rainforest, it also empowers the community while preserving their traditional spiritual and cultural values. Everywhere I went, people had great hope for the future and faith in wildlife works. They understand that they can either support one generation with the trees cut down, or support many generations in the future if they keep the trees standing. The people living in the Mai Ndombe project area are protecting this precious forest for the benefit of everyone. They now invite corporate leaders to join them in their mission and together protect the earth for future generations.
Okay, so that is our second project in a place called Mai Ndombe in the DRC. And I'm going to quickly finish the last of our presentation. So this question was, are we where we need to be? And the answer, I'm afraid, is still why not? Despite our successes and our aspirations to grow, the challenge is still enormous. Why is it taking so long? And why is it not moving more quickly? Now we're moving into the realm of my opinions. Certainly corporate responsibility was slow to arrive. There's no question that it took many years for companies to feel that they had a responsibility initially, and then for them to be convinced that they had a role to play in, or have a role to play in mitigating climate, and then to realize they weren't doing nearly enough. And to where we are now, where I would say, there's a rush of corporates trying to get involved not because they think it's the right thing to do, but because they recognize that their business is threatened. I mean, of course, I think many of them do recognize it's the right thing to do, but it's also become very obvious that climate change is a threat to their businesses in very direct ways and as well as indirect ways. Governments, but they're here now. I would say they've showed up, better late than never, and the financing that they can provide is vastly larger than the philanthropic world, and therefore can be very helpful in accelerating progress to protect the natural world. Government is not good at pay for performance, so the regulators could never or can never make final rules because they keep tinkering. They never heard that perfect is the enemy of the good. So this red idea was a fantastic idea in 2008, and they still haven't made all the rules at the UN. Literally haven't made all the rules to implement the Paris Agreement, which was signed in 2015. So there's just an inherent inertia in government, especially global government governance, that makes progress very slow. And then there's been a lot of noise against what we do out of fear of I don't know, people misbehaving or corporates with malintent getting involved. And so that's not helped, and that it still happens from time to time. We get criticized for all kinds of crazy things from groups that think that their approach to conservation is better than ours or different. And our argument is always, hey, we need all these ideas and more. And then finally, change is hard. It is really difficult to make these changes. And especially when you're talking about communities that are, they're not thriving when we arrive. So for them to be willing to trust in a change when they're kind of hanging on is very hard. A lot of work to gain their trust. We always work with local actors if we can, local NGOs on the ground that have the trust of the communities. We find great people in the communities that we can employ to do the work we do. But change is hard, as we all know. So that's why it's not moving quickly enough, but it is gaining speed very quickly now, and we're hopeful that we can make a much more significant dent in the problem in the next decade. And that's it for the formal presentation, and now I'm going to turn it back to Mark and the questions. But thank you very much for all of you that have stuck through this presentation. I hope it was interesting.
Mike, talk about interesting, man. I'm so excited. Thank you so much for sharing this story. I mean, honestly, today, all we hear is negative doomsday messages about saving the planet and climate change. and we recognize the science is very dire. But the truth is that if all we do is have these, horrific projections and all we talk about is the horrible future we have, people give up hope. And if all we talk about is just carbon as a gas that we can't see, taste, feel, none of our senses can even sense it. That's why, with all of this sort of doomsday messaging, we as a species have a hard time grasping the enormity. So what you are doing, and this is why I'm saying this, what you are doing is actually saving forests. Green used to mean forests and wildlife, and it used to mean, that's what green used to mean. Now it means green tech, and it's even hard to identify with green tech. So when I see what you're doing, which is you're saving forests, you're saving wildlife, and you're empowering people and giving them a reason to invest in saving the forests around them. I mean, this is totally groundbreaking to me. And I've always been a huge believer that for-profit conservation, market-based, let's just call it market-based conservation, that is much more sustainable than just sort of the standard NGO model. And I know that that's why you founded Wildlife Works in 1997. You just gave us a totally hopeful vision of the future. And, I just want to say thank you, because where we are, what we hear, I actually did the math, and I did the research. Every 11 days, we hear a doomsday prophecy about how the world's going to end because of climate change. And we recognize it is dire science, and it is scary what could happen, but nature-based solutions, what you are doing is so exciting. So could you tell me sort of like, as you see Wildlife Works in the nature-based solution space?
Yeah, I mean, we're very strange even in that space, I would say. A lot of people, because nature-based solutions is a phrase that's been picked up by a lot of corporates as a really just addressing climate mitigation. And so, a lot of the thought that they have, or that have in many cases, is plant trees, right? Okay, I got nothing against planting trees at all. We should plant trees. But if we don't stop cutting them down faster than we're planting them, we're wasting our time, right? And so planting trees is not going to get us out of this problem if we can't stop cutting the ones down that are already there. And planting trees, as many people that have been involved in restoration projects know, is super expensive. And in the end, if your aim is to restore natural forest, it's very hard to restore natural forest that actually has any facsimile of the original biodiversity that was lost when you cut down forest in the first place. So nature-based solutions is a term that's used very, very broadly and frequently by corporates to describe anything, the natural world and an improvement to reducing emissions. What we do is a very small niche of that. As I said, it's not small in the context of the challenge. The emissions coming from deforestation are huge, but we do a very specific thing, which is to stop deforestation and protect wildlife. And I'm an optimist by nature. I suppose you probably have to be to do what I'm doing, but just in case we can't figure it out, like I figure that humans are very creative and incredibly smart, and at some point we'll get serious enough about solving the problem to allow us to stay on Earth and in some version of the life we live now. Although we can all see that life that we've lived historically is being threatened. And if you go to these developing countries, it's no secret that they're suffering the consequences of climate that they didn't have much to do with. And so I'm hedging. I want to make sure we protect those magnificent wildernesses as much as possible for as long as possible while we get serious about climate in the north.
Good. Well, I mean, I appreciate what you said, because nature-based solutions and natural climate solutions, those are things that are thrown around by all the NGOs and, like you said, corporations, and they're not very well understood because, at Grace Farms Foundation and through our work at the Explorers Club, we also focus on saying, look, it's about protecting and preserving the existing forests and letting them regenerate on their own, which is much more effective for preserving biodiversity than trying to replant a forest that's been fully degraded. I mean, so preserve and protect. And then the last ditch resort is really, and the most expensive, is to restore, i.e. plant trees. Because once you lose the biodiversity in that forest by it being fully degraded, you can't get that back. You can plant a tree, but you can't restore a full ecosystem from just a tree planting. And so what you're doing is so imperative, we can't have forests, we can't have wildlife, and we can't have biodiversity without protecting forests. That's what people don't realize. So the forest communities, the native and indigenous and local forest communities, this is a sustainable way for them to have a future. Because at Grace Farms Foundation, we actually work on stopping exploitation of native and local and forest communities, but such as forced labor and slave labor conditions that they're put in. Can you tell us a little bit more about the work you do in the forest, the community empowerment in for instance, in Kenya, and some of your flagship projects?
Yeah, I mean, we often get asked that question: Are we forcing the community to do what we want them to do? And I always answer the question by saying, well, there was one of me and 120,000 of them.
Oh, I don't mean you forcing them. I meant to say.
No, I know. No, I don't mean you're asking me that question. I mean, we often get asked that question. I'm answering your question in a different way, which is that we do get asked that question: Are we forcing them to do these things? And I say, look, there's one of me and 120,000 of them when I started this project. And so who's forced? How could I possibly do something they didn't want to do? So, and that's our model. Our model is we start with one person in each of our projects that's not from the community, who goes in, obviously with our support now as a global organization, to develop a project on the ground and convince and train and work closely with the community on all the dimensions of our solutions. So, and the first thing that we always do, even in evaluating a program, is to assess the community's capacity for self-governance. Because oftentimes they've been marginalized, some of these communities, and pushed into the forest. Forests are not the place where humans go to in our sort of modern development model. They're the place where people come from. And so people that are in forests today are either, as you said, traditional forest dwellers who should be honored for their traditional understanding of the forest, or non-traditional forest dwellers who've been pushed there because of war or conflict or something else, and they're now trying to eke out a living in a forest that is challenging. Now, in the case of Mai Ndombe, they're fishermen, so they were on a lake. The lake used to support them. One of the unintended consequences of our one recent aid effort was that the mosquito nets that health organizations gave out in places like the Congo basin end up as fishing nets, because the community, their fishing nets break, and then somebody comes up, hands them something that looks like a fishing net, and so they start fishing with these mosquito nets, and they've literally fished out the largest freshwater lake in the Congo basin using mosquito nets over the last couple decades. And so one of our big ambitious projects is to say, they recognize it, right? They got too far down the path, and now they were desperate and they couldn't stop. But they now realize that they went too far, and now they would love to restore it. They have no idea where to begin. And so we're working with them to try and help them understand how to, restock the lake in a way, and how to ensure that they can go back to that lifestyle. So we work with the communities very closely. They have the capacity. They have amazing capacity, these communities, really, in most cases. Some cases they don't, because they've been pushed there and they're migrants, and they really don't have a governance system, and then we have to work with them on good governance before we can start bringing significant amounts of development into their community. But most of these communities can absorb a fair amount of development. We never do household payments. It's sort of a rule. Like, it's not about giving people money. It's about using money to do the things they want done. And it's almost always education is high on the list. Almost always healthcare is high on the list. And these are very important, because they're how people think of the future. It's how we think of the future is A, am I going to be alive to see the future? So, and B, are my kids going to be educated and have a better future than me? And so investing in those two dimensions of our work, although they may not seem obviously conservation initiatives, are very much, are very important to the work we do, and very important to the communities, more so.
You know, I'll just say one last thing before we go to the questions. I mean, the reason I'm so excited about your market-based conservation work is, you know, I've worked in the nonprofit world for, you know, most of my life, and I've seen that sort of what I call the bingos, the big international NGOs, you know, when they get a big grant or when they get a big donation from a philanthropist, you know, something like 20% immediately is taken off for administrative. Then it goes down to partners, and it goes down to subcontractors. And then by the time it gets down to the ground where it's supposed to help, you know, it could be something like 20% of the original donation. And that's why, you know, and then they go, well, we don't have a lot of money to do what we, you know, to do what we want to do on the ground, you know, and that just feeds the fundraising sort of machine. And when I see what you all are doing, you work on a very tight budget, a very effective budget, and you work to, you know, actually make the change, and you work in a for-profit world without all of the, you know, without all of the constrictions and restrictions that work in the nonprofit world. So I'm really excited about your strategy, and that you're, in my opinion, because I've been working in this space, you are the most established sort of for-profit market-based conservation organization, and that's why I'm so excited to be working with you and to be telling this story to the Explorers Club. So let's get to some questions. We've got tons of great questions, and I'll just start with a few of them, and we can go from there. So the first question is, this is from my friend Bonnie Wiper. She is with Thinking Animals. She's great. You may know Bonnie. She's also she's a fellow of the Explorers Club, and I really support her work. Bonnie has asked, how many RED projects are there at this point? And I know that truthfully, Wildlife Works is the premier organization. So at this point, you know, what would you say overall of the program? And then what would you say? And then how many are you currently working on? I mean, I know you're expanding immensely, and we're really excited about that. But overall, what would you say about the RED projects that are existing?
So there are about 80. I mean, roughly. I mean, I don't know the exact. The exact number is changing in, you know, around the world because this is a global effort. So there's probably about 80. Many of them are quite small. So, you know, much smaller than the ones that we do because they're community based or they're in a particular community forest. So there's quite a few small ones out there. But yeah, there's about 80. And I would say that's up from 50 or so, you know, in the last couple of years. So it's growing, you know, and we ourselves are going from 10 to 35. So, you know, we're by that point we'll be, you know, roughly a quarter of the projects out there probably, although, and so, and we're also trying to create best practices so that what we learn in the work we do can be shared with other groups that want to follow along and do the same kind of thing in the right way. It's very important to us that you know, if this market opportunity is going to grow, that it does continue to deliver on its promise, and it does continue to do things in the right way. And that knowledge is in our company now, and we don't want to. It's such an enormous challenge that we don't want to hold on to it. So we're doing also initiatives in countries like the DRC and in Colombia to share our knowledge with other developers who you might think of as competitors, but because the challenge in front of us is so enormous.
Well, yeah, no, I'm excited that you're spreading the model. And I know that Wildlife Works is one of the only organizations that's gotten a bond, impact funds and impact bonds that have been approved for this investment. And I know Wildlife Works is one of the few that's done that. So here we go to one of our members, Tom Dietz. Are all deforestation / RED projects created equal? So their contribution to GHG emissions, African deforestation versus tropical deforestation. Can you talk a little bit about sort of how that works?
So the science is the same for all of them, you know. Well, okay. So I'll take that back. So there is one major global standard that's used to verify projects like ours, and that's called the Verified Carbon Standard under a group called Verra, which is out of Washington, and was formed by a bunch of those bingos that you mentioned earlier as a way to codify the right way to go about projects. So then there are local standards that are emerging around the world because this is seen as a market opportunity. So you have to be a little bit careful about what standard the projects were verified under to know to what degree of quality they might be conforming. And that's not always necessarily a simple answer, because a local standard might have been designed to be simpler to implement so that rural communities can implement it without needing somebody like us or an investment from a technical support group and our investors. And so it might be simpler and a lighter method. So you have to, but as a consequence, it won't be as rigorous. It can't be as rigorous because they can't afford the international auditing and all these other things that we have to do under the Vera standard. So, but under the Vera standard, I would say in principle that from a carbon standpoint, they're all the same. So 1 ton of CO2 emissions reduced is the same. They all projects have to prove the argument for was there deforestation and how did they stop it. Those rules are changing over time. You know, how many different, satellite imagery is improving. So the ability to show historical deforestation and to project future deforestation and measure it accurately is changing all the time. So it is changing, but yeah, I would say that most projects under that standard are reliable from a carbon standpoint. They're definitely not all created equal in terms of their co-benefits to communities and biodiversity, because that's not required under the standard. Under the standard, all you have to do is show that you're protecting forests. You don't have to show that you're doing it in a way that's generating livelihoods and communities. You just have to show no harm. And there's a big difference between no harm and the kind of work we do. So I would say they're not all created equal. And the market is recognizing that. It can't recognize it in the product because the product is a carbon credit, but it can recognize it in the price, for example.
Okay.
Our projects typically command a higher price.
Okay, that's interesting, and the ones that are selected as the most effective for their yeah. Let me ask you this. So I think one part of that question was, if you've got a less dense forest like you do in Kenya versus Congo, okay, it's still, once you quantify the amount of trees, it's still that 1 ton of carbon that the credit becomes, even though there's fewer carbon credits potentially in Kenya than there is in Congo. I think maybe that was part of that question.
Okay, so yeah, so way fewer. So the basic science behind it is what was the rate of loss of forest before you showed up. So that's usually measured in acres per year, or hectares usually in the international market. So how fast was the forest disappearing in area per year? And then what is the carbon content lost every time a hectare is lost? So you have to measure the trees. That's what those young men are doing. We teach them how to go out and do forest inventory in much the same way it's done here in the United States. And so they can accurately measure the forest carbon stock. And then and that does vary dramatically from place to place. And therefore, for every hectare, so the rate changes from place to place. Like in some places, it's really disappearing fast, and some places it's really disappearing slowly. And then the amount that is emitted every acre that's lost also changes. So in a big tropical wet rainforest, you lose a lot of carbon when they cut it down and burn it. In a dry forest like Kenya, you don't lose that much carbon from the forest, but you actually lose a lot of soil carbon, because if the post-forest use is farming and they till the soil, then the carbon that's in the soil that's been stored ever gets oxidized and released. So that science is quite specific to location and is part of what we have to measure and then get audited by the international auditors. So it is very different. But as you say, once we're done, whether the answer is 1 million tons a year or 2 million tons a year or 50,000 tons a year, the product is always 1 ton. Each thing that we sell is 1 ton of emissions avoided.
And that's the key, is to show the reduction in deforestation and to prove and to do the science to quantify the carbon.
Correct.
And then and then let me ask you this. There's a couple other questions people are asking. One of them is, do you have any future plans to work in I know you don't work in the US, but do you have any future plans to work in the US?
We don't. There are a lot of good actors in the US. Of course, our forest estate is a fraction of what it used to be. But we have the benefit of relatively law-abiding society. Okay. I would say the biggest challenge in a temperate region like the US is fire. I'm sitting here in Northern California and fire season's on us already. mid-July. And I think that's the biggest problem is here, because fires here are stand destroying, as we call it, fires, whereas in most of the tropics, fires are not stand destroying, and there are very few natural fires in the tropics because it's so wet. So the fire is not a risk. In the US, fire is a big risk, so it creates a huge challenge to doing similar work here, because the idea here is that we're trying to stop human deforestation. We can't control deforestation, which of course is being made worse by our own long-term impact on climate. But so we don't have any plans in the US. I know people who are very engaged in the US. There's some great people working in. So if anybody wants to check out our website and send me a message, then I'm happy to connect you with people working in the US. There's some great people doing that work. There's one group called out of California called Eco Partners that has a program for aggregating private forest lands into large enough projects to make it work. So yeah, there's a number of great programs there.
That's awesome. Okay, that was from Cynthia Johnson. So yeah, check out it's wildlifeworks.com. Is that the website?
That's us.
Okay, good. So this is a good question, because I think people have heard of carbon credits, but what I love about Wildlife Works is that there's actually a place that you are saving the forest. There actually is a place and people that you are helping when you support Wildlife Works and when Wildlife Works is doing their job. And so can you tell us about when you sell the carbon, what markets do you sell it to? And who are the buyers? Just give us an example, for instance.
I mean, it's predominantly corporates. I mean, we do sell to individuals, but when you have, we have a portfolio that's going to be 30 million tons a year. The average carbon footprint of an American, which is of course high by global standards, is only 20 or 30 tons a year for an individual. So you have to sell to a lot of individuals for us to move. So we tend to sell to corporates. We do sell to some individuals through our website, but it's mostly corporates. And when we work with corporates, it's like reduce your footprint first, okay? But so all well-intentioned corporates are trying to reduce their footprint by reducing their dependence on fossil fuels and trying to use renewable energy and all these other things. But in every company, really, there are what we call unavoidable emissions, things they can't get rid of. Either it's cost prohibitive, and you might say, oh, boo-hoo, but they're not going to put themselves out of business just to be a good climate citizen. So it's either cost prohibitive or it's a technology that doesn't exist yet. So we don't yet have the ability to fly jets in a carbon neutral way, and any approach that we've been taking involves other risks, like, okay, if we're going to use agricultural land to grow crops that we're going to turn into fuel, that's a problem, because now food security is threatened in places where people want to do that. So there are sectors which we call hard to abate, and those are the ones that have generally the biggest footprint, and those are generally our customers, because they want to do what they make money, and they're trying to do what they can do with emissions that they can't get rid of in their own business. And so it's a hierarchy, and there are a number of places you can read about the hierarchy that corporates should follow if they want to be good citizens. And that's important to us, that we're not greenwashing a corporate that's misbehaving. But by the same token, we've all benefited from the society built around fossil fuels and hard to abate sectors. And so we're willing to work with the best actors in any industry to help them find a path to decarbonization, and in the meantime, to use their funds to mitigate a very difficult problem for climate in the tropical forests.
That's awesome. Yeah, and I agree. Look, if we need to engage the corporations and not make them enemies of it, in quote unquote environmentalism, because the corporations have the money. And if they're willing to put it towards saving real places and empowering real people and saving wildlife, I mean, let's do it. That's my belief system, as long as they're not, shady actors.
Yeah, I mean, some of them we could be enemies of.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So I guess it's based on the corporation, but let's do a few more questions. So I have one from Lana Howe, and for Mike. Would you please elaborate a bit more on how deforestation each year is causing the 7 billion tons of emissions?
Okay, well, so a tree is essentially, mostly made up of carbon, right? So trees and any living plants grow by taking carbon out of CO2 in the atmosphere. That's why they're good for us, because they take CO2 out of the atmosphere, which is the greenhouse gas that is mostly responsible for warming, and they combine it with hydrogen that they get from water. So they need water to grow, and they create cellulose, which is the chemical structure, carbon and hydrogen of trees, of all plant materials. And so they do this through the miracle of photosynthesis. And so they're sucking carbon out of the atmosphere to grow. And when somebody comes along and cuts that tree down and burns it, it's reversing that process. The burning is basically turning the carbon that's in that tree back into CO2. It's combining with oxygen in the atmosphere and turning it back into CO2 and putting it back in the atmosphere as a greenhouse gas. So what centuries took to store in forests, minutes can put back by cutting down and burning a tree. And that's generally what happens. So people may say, oh, but it's sustainable logging. Look, when they cut a tree down in the forest, they keep the bottom 8 meters of the tree. So that's about 25 feet of the tree, because that's what they can put on a truck.
Wow.
And the rest they leave on the forest floor, and which is in some cases in a forest, that's another 50 meters. So that's another 150 feet of tree that's on the ground in the forest that was left there to rot and to release its carbon back, or to be burned by communities who see that land, now that it's being cleared of big trees, as an opportunity to farm, because you can't farm under a canopy of big trees. So they see that as a way to improve their own food security. So they come and they burn, and that releases the carbon. So even sustainable logging in a place like that has significant consequences, although it's the better alternative clearly than clear cutting or other kinds of forestry. But often people say, well, forestry isn't really the enemy. Well, it kind of is, because there's a thing called an impenetrable forest, which is what these big tropical forests are before a bulldozer shows up. And the reason that they're still there after millennia of people living in and around them is because they're really hard to cut down unless you have a bulldozer. And if you have a bulldozer, all bets are off. And so that's what happens. These professional logging companies come in with bulldozers, they put their logging trails into the forest, they knock the trees down. And then after that, anybody can come in and clear up the remaining smaller trees, and then the land becomes available to farmland, and people will farm it. Whether they need to or not is a question. Of course, they need food security, and that's why we work heavily on food security in areas that have already been deforested, so that they can be more productive in the land that's already been deforested and not need to rely on new deforestation. So yeah, it's that's the method. Sorry, that was a long recourse, but it's a basic chemistry thing that absorbs carbon. Trees absorb carbon when they're growing, release it when they're being burnt, or when they're rotting. When they're rotting, they release it as methane, which is even more potent as a greenhouse gas than carbon dioxide.
And okay, and also, as you just said, so then they cut it down, then eventually it's burned, then they start tilling the soil, which releases all of that carbon in the soil, and then oftentimes they bring in livestock, which also is super inefficient, beef, for instance. So it's like this cycle that just keeps feeding itself.
Yeah,
So
they bring in livestock, and livestock is one of the largest sources of emissions on Earth. And interestingly enough, most people think it's the dung from. It's not. It's the belching. Sorry. Right. And by the way, I also want to say, for those of you that have sensitive stomachs, I apologize for the couple shots in the video but that's the reality of our world is we see pretty grim stuff out in the field. But we tried. I sorry for not warning you about that. But yeah. Cows belch, and because that's where most of the emissions come from cattle.
And so methane, huge methane releasers. Yeah, so I mean, that's why keeping the forest intact. That's why keeping the forest intact, keeping the carbon intact in the forest and in the soil below it is so incredibly important. And that's why I'm so excited about what you all are doing. Then there's a few more questions. Let's see. I have a couple more from Bonnie Wiper. One of them is, what can we do as individuals? What can we do to support your work at Wildlife Works? How can we make a difference and support your work?
Well, I mean, I think, firstly, each of us share a responsibility for our own footprint, right? So, something. We all have a footprint. We can all mitigate our own footprint in some way or another. So, whether it's with our project or somebody else's, we can all take responsibility for our own footprints, and that's not expensive for any family in America, really. And not that's just to say that people have a lot of spare cash, but it's not an expensive thing, and I think people can take responsibility for that. I think that people should support corporates that are making these kinds of commitments, you know, like just in the way that you support a company that makes organic products that you like. You can seek out the companies that are being publicized for making commitments to climate, and you can give them your business, and you can post on Instagram or Facebook or social media that you support these actions that they're taking. They really care about those things. You know, they care about whether their consumers and are in the market care about what they're trying to do. And some of them, they're not. You know, that was one of the biggest hurdles we had to do, was to say, look, if you wait for your consumer to tell you to do these things, we'll all be dead and gone long before that happens, because people are busy. You know, you're not going to get this critical mass of people coming and saying, do the right thing, you know, but so you're going to have to just do the right thing, because you know it's the right thing to do, Mr. Corporate, and or Mrs. Corporate. And then what you should expect is you're going to get reaction and hopefully a positive response. So we always say, you know, seek out companies that are doing the right thing, and then, you know, criticize the ones that aren't. You know, there's definitely not an even playing field out there. That was also a big hurdle for corporates, is, well, why would I do it when all my competitors are not? And our answer is, well, someone's got to start, you know, and so why not you? And so we spent 10 years beating on corporate doors to try and get them to take on that responsibility. And they're now really stepping up, and there's going to be a bit of a, you know, now there's a bit of a FOMO, as they call, fear of missing out. They don't want to be the company that was on the wrong side of history, I think. And that's a large phenomenon that we see going on now.
Good. Well, I mean,
Bonnie, I love your work, Bonnie. So I've been to Bonnie's event in New York once, and I was very impressed with the passion Bonnie and all of her team members have for the work they do. So
yeah.
So Thinking Animals, awesome.
Yeah, Thinking Animals United, they are top notch, but you know, so you've sold millions of tons of credit. How much have you sold just from the Kenya project alone?
So it generates 1.5 million tons a year for the last 15 years, and we're sold out. So we've sold all of those. So what's that? 17.5 million tons over 15 years. So it's the Congo project generates a couple million tons a year. We're soon to be sold out of those. So yeah, the market has changed. I mean, for many years we were sort of, you know, preaching in the wilderness, and now we're preaching to the choir, as it seems. So it's getting a lot easier for us, and that's, you know, why we were able to attract more investment and grow, because the market is definitely there. So and that's one thing I would say about the conservation work we do, is it's so much better funded. I mean, because it's very place specific. Like, all the money we earn from the credits from one particular program has to go back into that program. We don't use it to start projects elsewhere. It has to go back into that program. And so they all have an incredibly large amount relative to what conservation groups are used to. You know, we did a project in Cambodia with a group that was struggling and had been investing all their money and all their philanthropy for over a decade, and was almost running out of money. And then I'd say in the last 5 years, since we convinced them, it took us a long time to convince their board that they should let us come and work with them on a RED project. But once we did, they've earned well over, I'm going to say $50 million in the last 5 years. Right, it's a big project, and it was very expensive to operate. And but now, you know, they've got financial security for the next decade, and that's the kind of thing that we're trying to do now with other conservation groups that are doing important work that don't, you know, aren't generating enough funding to thing. And there's always a need for philanthropy. It's always, you know, going to be welcome. It's just that it's never enough, and so that's why we love partnering with groups like yours in the field, because we can, you know, 1 + 1 is 3, right? If we collaborate, we have a team of people on the ground, 4 in these places we work, which is luckily that most conservation groups cannot afford. And so that provides, you know, management and infrastructure and accounting, administration, all these things funded by our carbon projects that can then enable very efficient use of funding to the field from groups like yours for certain dimensions that are beyond our ability to fund directly.
That's incredible. And yes, you're right. Philanthropy can fill a niche, but, you know, that's why what you're doing in the market based is just incredible. And you're right, NGOs have the same goals, but they don't necessarily have the effective strategy that you have. So that's what I love about Wildlife Works, is you can complement the work of the NGOs or the philanthropy with this I mean, look, philanthropists and corporations have gotten smart. They want return on investment. They want actual effective altruism or effective return on investment. They don't want it just to all disappear into the ether and make a small difference. So that's why I'm so psyched about the work that you're doing. You know, this is everybody that's watching. If you have a corporation, consider supporting and teaming up with Wildlife Works. If you're an individual, you know, go on the website, find out who they work with to support those corporations, and also, you know, how you could get involved. And then, you know, there's also philanthropy opportunities that you can always, that's where I specialize in. So, you know, these are the kind of things you can all make a difference. And I'm just grateful for some hope in the world. You know, we need to do this work. Green means forest, wildlife, and, you know, and we as people, it's something tangible we can support. So I just want to say thank you to Mike Korchinski of Wildlife Works and all of our people who have made amazing questions. Those were great. And I'll just say for, you know, upcoming lectures, we've got the Wednesday, we've got the Explorers Club 50, all of this, the 50 pioneers that you have not heard of, new members of the Explorers Club that are making a difference in the field. So watch that on Wednesday at 7 o'clock. And then next Monday, we're going to be talking with Jeff Phoenix about hunting for Atlantis. So we've got, you know, at the Explorers Club, we've got all kinds of, you know, we are a science-based organization. So everything you're going to hear from us is based in science, and that, but I'm grateful, Mike, about your message. I look forward to promoting and supporting your work and getting some more projects going. And I'm grateful to everyone who's tuned in. You know, check out wildlifeworks.com and get involved and make a difference. So thanks, Mike.
Thanks very much, Mark, and all of the folks at the Explorers Club for organizing this event.
All right, we'll see you all later. Take